Where did it come from that somehow we think tennis is so important that we are reserving spots in exclusive universities with massive preferences for kids who have a good backhand? Like I just find that it's just absurd. Like if you really believe, as I do, that elite schools are incredibly important, they are places where brilliant people work and teach and do research, and they turn out people who will transform our country. Why are we squandering spots on kids who just want to play tennis? That's not what a elite education's for.
Hello there, Craig Melvin here. Welcome to my basement bourbon bar, and welcome to our little podcast called Glass Half Full. This is where we, look at the milestones and the moments that really shape people's lives, personally and professionally. And I'm really excited about today's guest. I have been reading Malcolm Gladwell for years. He's got a new book out. It's called Revenge of the Tipping Point, 25 years after the original book, The Tipping Point. But Outliers, Blink, he's been writing books like this for a year where he tries to take complicated issues and really distill them into digestible bits and pieces. We talked about that. We talked about some of the concepts that he has introduced into our sort of lexicon, if you will, in society over the last few decades. But we also talk about him being a father of two in his 60s. And we also address some of the controversies that have surrounded some of his writings and thoughts over the last few years. It was a really fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Malcolm Gladwell, thank you for your time. I think you probably know how we start this show. It's called Glass Half Full. So we start with a toast. I'll be drinking my usual, and I believe you're toasting with your
Cappuccino.
cappuccino. All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Let's start with the tipping point, the original tipping point, because I remember reading it years ago, and
Mhm.
I walked away feeling hopeful, optimistic even, um, that, all of this could be changed. Is that how you felt at the time?
I think so. I mean, I think it was, the late 90s are this kind of magical period. Cold War ends, crime goes away, teenage pregnancy, which was a thing everyone was like obsessed with, vanishes, one social problem after another, one geopolitical problem after another. Do we have a balanced budget at some point in that era? I think we did, maybe a little bit later. It's like, how could you not have been optimistic in 1999, 2000? The single biggest problem of that era was Y2K.
I remember.
The illusory, uh, the illusory fear that a minor software glitch would cause, I don't even know what, I can't remember.
Worldwide catastrophe.
I know, but like in today's, we would shrug that off in 10 minutes today because we have such bigger things to worry about. That's what we were worrying about back then. It's a very different time.
Are you as hopeful and optimistic today as you were when you wrote the original Tipping Point?
Well, I'm more hopeful and optimistic personally, but less hopeful and optimistic when I think about the world, if that makes sense.
It does, but expand on that. Why are you more optimistic about your own life and not as optimistic about the lives of others?
Well, I'm happier, more settled. I have a family that I adore.
You started late. You started very late.
I know, I
By
blew
the
it.
way, kudos to you for becoming a father in his late 50s.
I know. Kudos is one way of saying that. No, they are actually there are many things about being a late father that are because I'm so much more settled.
Yes.
So I don't have my when my kids freak out, it doesn't actually freak me out in a way that probably would have if I was 25. I like where I'm living. I like people I work with. I don't know. I don't really have any complaints with the way. Whereas if you talk to me in my 30s when I wrote the original Tipping Point, I think I was like a kind of typical mid 30s, not really knowing what was going on with my life kind of person. So I was a lot more unsettled personally in that era.
for folks who aren't familiar with the concept at all, in the simplest of terms, a few sentences, what is a tipping point?
It is, I mean, it is used most frequently in a context of epidemics. And it describes the fact that epidemics do not increase slowly and steadily over time. What happens is they kind of shuffle along at a very low level, and then they hit a kind of critical moment of a moment of critical mass, and they explode all at once. So COVID is this kind of rare, slightly scary thing circulating in, central China in December of 2019. And then by February of 2020, the whole world is terrified. That's a very typical trajectory for an epidemic. It goes from central China to
Everywhere.
everywhere all at once. That's a tipping point. And that happens whenever you have a contagious phenomenon that follows the principles of epidemics.
We're going to come back to the book in a moment, but the podcast is devoted to taking a look at the moments and, in some cases, the milestones in a person's life that shapes who they are, shapes who they become professionally and personally. And as you look back on your 60 plus years of living, is there a moment that you look back to and you think, that was when I really started thinking about becoming a writer, becoming a journalist?
I almost feel like if you're really honest with ourselves, we would say that there are pivotal moments that we navigate every week, if not every day.
I would agree.
The one that came to mind was when I was starting out in journalism I was at the Washington Post, and I was in my late 20s. I applied for and was awarded the job of European correspondent for the Washington Post, which would have meant I would have moved to Berlin for something like 3 to 4 to 5 years. And I turned it down. And I really think that was a absolutely crucial moment in everything about my life.
Why? How so?
I don't think I would have come home. I think I would have stayed. I think I'd be in Europe to this day, because I'm not an American. Always wanted to still want to move to Europe. I mean, I think about it all the time. I love Europe. I think I would have gone to Germany, and I would have stayed in Germany, or I think I would be somewhere in Western Europe to this day, if not somewhere else. Everything I got in, instead of taking that job, I took the job of New York correspondent for the Washington Post. And that's when I started thinking about crime and tipping points, and launched and met I went to the New Yorker, and all those kinds of things that I think of as my career stem from the decision to go to New York as opposed to go to Berlin.
And before all of that, Malcolm Gladwell grows up in Canada. You're a member of this small Mennonite community. And I've always known that you were mixed race. I did not know that your mother's Jamaican and your father's English.
Yes.
Growing up, did you identify with one race more than the other? And I ask that because I've got biracial children as well, and I have heard that from time to time, children do that in their formative years.
Yeah. I really didn't. I didn't have. Canada's a very different. The kind of racial politics of the community I grew up in Southern Ontario were so profoundly different from anything I've experienced in the United States, and race was so there's no history of racial antagonism in that part of Canada. The few Black people that are around tend to be recent West Indian immigrants, like my mom. And there was a very small number of them. Particularly then, there's a big wave of Jamaican immigrants, West Indian immigrants, to Toronto later in the kind of 80s, 90s. But it just never comes up. I mean, I have no.
So you didn't grow up being aware of racism?
No, never thought about it. My mom was welcomed with open arms by this community. It was a very religious, a very kind of it was a Mennonite community, and the Mennonites are exceedingly open in their they have a they have they really do take the idea of tolerance very seriously. It's a central part of their kind of approach to the world. And they are cosmopolitan in the sense that they are very actively engaged with the rest of the world. So my mom was not my mom was treated with open arms. She wasn't considered to be a curiosity or an oddity or an object of hostility. She was just because she was, I think, because she was such a committed Christian, and this was such a Christian community that was enough. It's like that's how she was categorized. She was categorized as one of them because she was someone who took her faith seriously, and that was the single most important thing in that community. I just never thought about it, and I remember once my mom had a friend named Joe Kennedy, who was a Jamaican who lived I think she lived in Atlanta, and came to visit my mom. This would have been in the 70s, and I remember overhearing Joe Kennedy say to my mom, "You could cut the racism in Atlanta with a knife." And I was like 6 or 7. I had no idea what that meant. And it was such a kind of weird concept. Like, I didn't really know what racism was. The idea that Joe Kennedy, who's like a friend of my mom's, Jamaican, came from a place where Black people run the show. It wasn't like, racism isn't on your mind if you grew up in Jamaica.
Yeah.
And she's reporting from the United States, which I was very much aware of, and coming back with this kind of verdict that was so shocking and foreign to me. So yeah, no, I didn't think about it till I came to America.
It sounds like that was one of those moments where a seed may have been planted to a certain extent, that there was this foreign concept that was introduced to you at a very early age. Well, let's talk about the revenge of the tipping point for a moment here, because you start the book and you end the book focusing on the opioid crisis in this country. Why use that topic to bookend it?
Because I felt like, and I still feel like, the opioid crisis is one of those. There are certain things in America. If you were to be an alien, a Martian, looking down on the United States, what would strike you as being weird and strangest about the United
Well,
States?
I would maintain that it's the fact that you have human beings walking around with poop bags, and we actually pick up the dog's poop and tie it up and throw it
Yeah.
in the
That would be
trash.
on the list. That would be on the list.
That would, I think aliens would be like, who are these strange people?
Yeah. Well, a serious answer would be, I was listening to an interview I did for a podcast episode 2 years ago with a guy who was an ER doc on south side of Chicago, and he grew up in that neighborhood. Guy's name was Abdullah Price, extraordinary guy, and he was talking about how many people who he knew well had been killed over the course of his life. He's in his 30s, and he said people that he would have had who would have, texted him at some point in the previous 6 months, it would be 35. And really, really close people, like friends, it would be 12. And I just thought, that's the first thing that would be weird to the Martian. Like, wait, that's normal? Like, there can be somebody who's like a highly educated, sophisticated ER doc at a big teaching hospital in the south side of Chicago who is 34 years old, and 30 people 35 people he knows have been killed over the course of his life. Like, that it makes no sense to me. And I know all about America. The Martian would be like, what? Just like, are you guys crazy? And the other Martian thing would be, wait, 120,000 people died of overdoses like last year, whatever. Maybe 110, I've forgotten. It peaked at 120. It's come down a little bit. But basically, we've averaged around 100,000 overdose deaths over the last 10 years or so. I think the Martian would look at that and say, Wait, this is the wealthiest, most technologically advanced country in the world. Like, what is going on? And why aren't you talking about this every single day?" So I wanted to start and end the book with the opioid crisis just because I just don't understand why it's not talked about more. Like, it just, in the things we do care to talk about comparatively are so trivial next to the things we don't talk about. And I've never understood that.
Well, do you think that's because it's easier to talk about certain things that are simpler to understand than it is to talk about things like the opioid crisis, where you're talking about addiction, you're talking about our healthcare system, you're talking about the perception of addiction is it's and by the way, I live in a family where my my wife's cousin struggled mightily with opioid addiction for years, and he died 2 years ago, and
Yeah.
it in and out of rehab, um, and had resources at his disposal, and just he couldn't, as my grandmother would say, he couldn't just get the monkey off his back. I do think we live in a time where we do view addiction differently than we did maybe 25 years ago at least, but it doesn't seem to have necessarily manifested itself into
Mhm.
real world solutions.
Well, I would have thought at the very least you would see prominent people, people running for office, people in positions of leadership who would stand up and acknowledge it and say, I'm going to do my best to kind of come up with some better way of dealing with this crisis. I would have thought there was something to be there would be a an incentive for people to say things like that. Not an incentive, but a motivation to say that. And there doesn't seem to be any great motivation in public life for people to talk about that. And I don't have a good explanation for why that's the case.
To your point, I am interested as to why. I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, I think some of it's shame. I do. I
Yeah.
think there are a lot of families where it happens, and everyone blames themselves, and they don't want to talk about it as a result of that.
Mm.
You also write about this idea of the magic third.
Hmm.
Explain that concept.
It's an extension of this sort of tipping point idea. And there's a lot of research that suggests that when we talk about social epidemics, the movement of ideas, the way that changes in behavior, what real dramatic differences start to happen when uh, when a group reaches about 30% of the total. In other words, if you want to change the minds of Americans on gay marriage, you don't need to have 51% of Americans being in favor of gay marriage. You need to have about a third. And when you have a third of the population that is thinking about something and articulating their position and speaking up, that's enough to move the, not everyone else, obviously, but to kind of create a systemic change. And this has been, there's millions of examples of this about how group dynamics shift dramatically when you hit a third. Um, it's why it has, I talk about this in the context of applicability to what do we mean when we say we want to have diversity in an organization? And there's a big difference between having 5% of your organization not look like everybody else and having 25% not look like everybody else, right? And the difference is when you got 5%, the people in that 5% cannot be themselves. They are other. They are stigmatized, scrutinized, also weirdly ignored, stereotyped, whatever. When you're 25% or 30%, it doesn't happen in the same way. You could be normal. We've seen this with, and I talk a lot in the book about all the research that was done around women joining the workforce in the 70s and how important, like how crucial this process was. You had to hit critical mass. It makes you realize that all too often when we talk about diversity, we settle for symbolic diversity, which is
Tokenism, even.
tokenism. Yeah. And it really kind of radicalizes you to when you sort of understand that this is a numbers game. You want to have real diversity, you can't just bring in two people and call it a day. And I think that's what we like to do. We like to bring in two people and call it a day.
I connected to that part of your book. Um, and I also connected with another part of the book where you talk about Ivy League schools. You talk about Harvard specifically, and some of the backdoor ways into some of America's most prestigious institutions.
Mm.
Why do you think Harvard has more varsity sports than just about any other school?
Than any other school. They
I
have the
know,
most in the country.
I know.
Because, well, they most of those sports are country club sports, and they give massive admissions preferences for athletes, and it's a nice way to get lots of rich kids who aren't that smart into your school.
But conversely, though, Malcolm, when one could contend that going back to your previous point, if you are serious about creating a legitimately diverse work environment, school environment, then that's one way to do it.
No, but that's not what they're using it for. So we think of sports as a way of diversifying because we think, oh, it's football and basketball, and you get lots of young black kids into your white school that way. They're a tiny fraction here. Harvard's not playing that game. It's rowing and fencing
Lacrosse.
and lacrosse and rugby. And tennis. There are no there are no there are no black kids. There are no like young like black kids from the inner city playing lacrosse, right? No one's there's a reason they have those sports because those are sports played in private schools, and this allows them to tap in preferentially into the products of private education in this country. I have a whole thing in there about tennis. The only way you can play D1 tennis in America right now is if you play junior tennis. And the only way you can play junior tennis is if your parents are willing to shell out at least 100 grand on your tennis every year. So you tell me what having spots for tennis players does to your undergraduate population.
And
It's just
by the way, those kids, they don't need financial aid.
no, they don't need financial aid.
No.
They're like, but the idea, where did it come from that somehow we think tennis is so important that we are reserving spots in exclusive universities with massive preferences for kids who have a good backhand? Like I just find that it's just absurd. Like if you really believe, as I do, that elite schools are incredibly important, they are places where brilliant people work and teach and do research, and they turn out people who will transform our country. Why are we squandering spots on kids who just want to play tennis? That's not what a elite education's for. Plenty of places to go and play tennis.
You devote a fair amount of ink in the book to that. I would maintain, for me at least personally, the part of the Revenge of the Tipping Point that I found most fascinating, and I was actually somewhat embarrassed by the fact that I didn't know this. As a society in this country, we did not use the term Holocaust to describe what happened to Jews until the 70s.
Yeah.
I didn't know that, and I don't
Yeah.
think most people who read your book probably knew it either. Explain how that could happen.
Yeah. So first of all, it doesn't make any sense because we all assume, oh, the Holocaust was such an extraordinary, horrific event. It must have been talked about constantly after the war. It was not. And there was a considerable amount of scholarly literature devoted to verifying this. But I did all kinds of things with the book. Went back and read the college textbooks that were most widely in use in America in the 50s and 60s. In their discussion of the Second World War, how much they talk about the Holocaust? And the answer is almost not at all. Like 2 sentences. The word Holocaust is never used. They talk about concentration camps or they don't even, there's one of the most widely used college history textbooks, European history textbooks, talks about Anne Frank in like 2 sentences, doesn't mention that she's Jewish and misspells her name. It's crazy. It's just like, and I think it was, and not only that, it is also the case that many people in the Jewish community didn't want to talk about it. There was I talk about this in the book, a kind of considered strategy by the American Jewish community They felt that they were inviting further anti-Semitism by describing what they were thinking of in that moment as a kind of a shameful or moment of weakness in their history. And so there were early attempts to build some Holocaust memorials that were scuttled by the Jewish community. They didn't want them. And in fact, we don't get a major Holocaust. There's only one Holocaust museum in the country, which I talk about, until the 70s. It's this one in LA that started in the 60s. There's nothing else. Every single other Holocaust organization, memorial, museum happens after 1979. It's just, and the moment, the shift comes when there is this famous television miniseries called The Holocaust
On NBC.
on NBC. Yeah, which in a way that would be impossible to understand today, just overnight shifts the way it gives permission for people to talk about what happened. And also not just permission, it gives them a language to talk about what happened. We sometimes make this mistake, Craig, that when people don't talk about something, we say they're in denial. That is certainly one condition of silence, but there are also other conditions where people don't talk about something because they don't know how to talk about it, or people don't talk about it because they don't think they are allowed to. It's a verboten subject. And these are three completely different states. Don't believe it, don't think I can talk about it, don't know how to talk about it.
You're right.
And every time we have this issue, I think we need to be very clear about which of those categories we're talking about.
And I would take it a step further. I think you could probably blame some of modern society's ills on what you just described. People who aren't their intentions are pure. They avoid topics because they don't want to get canceled. They don't want to offend. They don't know how to talk about it. They don't feel like they have agency to talk about it, and it leads to a lot of important conversations just simply not being had.
In smaller, more cohesive cultures, there tends to be more agreement on the rules of discourse, right? On how should we talk about this. But we in this country right now are struggling to find a common definition of the rules of discourse.
And we have struggled for some time.
Yeah.
And at some point, hopefully, there's a resolution on at least deciding how we can engage in civil debate. I do this segment on the podcast. It's called the redo, and this is where I ask you about some things that you would, if you could do them all over again, if you would go back and change something. So I want to ask you about one thing in particular because I read about this a while back. You introduced this concept years ago, and I honestly forget which book. It may have been Outliers, but um, broken window policing.
Tipping point. The first tipping point.
It was the first tipping point.
Yeah.
And you introduced this concept, and then years later, you sort of changed your mind about that to a certain extent. Would you redo introducing the concept altogether?
Well, I would, first of all, I don't have any problem with changing my mind.
I know.
I think it's what normal, healthy thing for people to do. And
You're one of the few, by the way.
I know. Turns out I'm one of the few. But I don't feel bad about it. I feel like, and a lot of times when I make an argument, I like to think out loud. So a lot of times when I think about my books are like having a conversation with someone at dinner. And I say, blah, 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 blah. The other person goes, yeah, but what about this, 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 this? And I go, oh, that's interesting. And then that's my whole life. My whole life is me saying stuff, people responding, and me kind of like, or me meeting someone who's smarter than me and realizing, oh, I didn't know that. That's super interesting, right? That's my whole life.
What changed your mind about that in particular?
We got data. So what happened was there's two things that were going on with broken windows. There was the observation, which I think remains true, that, and there is good evidence to support this, that disorder in the environment invites crime. And there's a incredible thing that's been going on in Philadelphia where they've been going around and they've been cleaning up vacant lots. It's been going on for a couple of years now. They've cleaned up thousands of vacant lots in, like, I think, West Philly. And they have documented how they go into a vacant lot, they clean the trash, they clear the grass, they plant lawn, put a chair in there, and keep mowing the lawn. And then they document over time how the neighborhood changes. And that makes a appreciable difference in all manner of crime, right up to homicide. People are happier, they're calmer. There's no question that makes a difference. What happened, though, was that under Giuliani in New York City, that idea was interpreted to say, and it is also the case that if we deploy the police really, really aggressively to crack down on even the smallest crimes, misdemeanors, what have you, that will also bring down the crime rate. And I believed that part of the argument. And that part of the argument, in other words, the interpretation of broken windows as a law enforcement strategy, as opposed to a social strategy, that part of the argument we now realize was probably false. Because New York, it was the policy was called stop and frisk, where they were just basically, if you were a young black kid on the streets of New York, the cops on hundreds of thousands of occasions would stop and frisk that kid on the theory that was proving a deterrent to crime. The courts declared that policy illegal. The police stopped doing it, and crime fell even further. So if you observe that, you have to change your mind. Like, you don't have any choice, right? The argument that you were a party to was put to the test empirically, and it failed. So my point is, what options do I have? There's only one intellectually honest option to have, and that is to say, you know what? I was wrong to have endorsed that portion of the argument because we know better now.
So that's a redo from Malcolm Gladwell. Let me see if you would redo something else that, as you probably know, made some news recently. Malcolm Gladwell on trans athletes. Would you redo what you said years ago initially about trans athletes competing in sports?
Well, so this is a case where everything that was said in that controversy was so a million miles to what I actually did that it became hilarious. Here's what I said, and you tell me whether I should redo this. 4 years ago, I was the moderator on a panel about whether trans women should be able to compete with biological women in elite professional sports, right? I was the moderator. There was one guy who said no, and there were two people who said yes. My job was to moderate the discussion. And I was told beforehand, this is a hot button issue. Don't get us in trouble. Just present both sides. It was a big crowd. So I did my job moderating. It was really, really hard. First of all, why did I say yes? But I did it. And then 4 years pass, and I'm on a podcast out there with this guy. What are the guys? The guy who was against trans women participation. He has a very, very, very niche podcast out of Johannesburg, where he talks about track and field and rugby and cycling. And I'm on the panel 4 years later, and I say to him at the 1 hour mark in our 2 hour conversation, we have a 1 minute reminiscence about the panel. And I say to him, there was this moment on the panel when one of the elder panelists said something. And it was one of those moments in the conversation where what she said really crystallized the whole argument. There was that moment, remember, and I've forgotten her name. She's a very, very thoughtful person. They were the trans athlete on the panel. And at one point they turned to you, Ross, and they said, Ross, you have to let us win. And it was at that moment that I realized this argument has gone to the furthest extreme. When I heard that, I was like, this is nuts. And yet I didn't say anything. And I should have said to her, I should have jumped in and said, okay, tell me more about that. Follow up on that. And I didn't. And I wish I had. And I think about that a lot. And then we went on and discussed the 800 meters and all kinds of other subjects. That's all I did. And then I wake up like 2 days later and this whole thing has exploded. And there are people saying that I said stuff I didn't say. Like, I was the moderator on a panel, and I had, as I like to do, and I refuse to redo it because I refuse to be someone who does not revisit the things that they do. I believe that everything I've ever said and done should be open to self-reflection. I should be able to go back 4 years to a role I played on a panel and say, I think at that moment I wasn't a good moderator. I should be able to say that. Like, what kind of crazy world do we live in when we don't want people to engage in that kind of self-reflection?
It's interesting you raise that point because I listen I agree with you, and
Yes.
and and I contend that if we had more people who uh, self-reflected or who just
Uh,
self-aware period, but who certainly self-reflected, that would be better for society at large. But we live in a time where it's it's someone says something in 1994, and if in 2024 they say something else, it's, oh my God, he's changed this, but oh my gosh, he's changed your mind. And to your point, if I think Oprah once said, when you know better, you do better.
mhm.
And I find myself sometimes now, I'll go back and I'll watch an interview that I conducted some years ago, and I'll say, gosh, I wish I would have asked it this way, and I wish I would have asked this follow up. But sometimes I find that I'm doing that through the lens of today, knowing what I know now.
Mm,
But that happened to me a couple years ago, and it's tricky for journalists to ever admit when we have made a mistake or when we would have done something differently. But I interviewed the vice president some years ago. At that point, it was Vice President Harris, and the way that I framed the question,
mhm,
um, in the moment, I was like, this is fine. And then after the interview, I caught a lot of flack from a lot of different corners, and so I called up my very first news director, whose opinion I value and trust, and I said, hey, I'm catching holy hell about this particular this question. And she said to me, she said, I've known you for a long time. You made the question about you. And looking back on it, maybe you could have phrased it this way or that way. And it stung. It did.
mm,
And then I went back and I watched the interview, and I realized she was right. She was
mhm,
right.
mhm,
But I just feel like that's something it's so uncommon now, Malcolm Gladwell. Like, it's very
mm,
difficult to admit that, yes, I changed my position because I have new information, or I changed my opinion because I've been exposed to new
mm.
things.
Yeah. I don't think it's funny. I think there's a distinction. So I was not enormously this recent controversy I was a part of. I I was it didn't affect me that. I didn't get all worked up about it because I think there's a big distinction between the way most people think and the way the extremely online people think. I don't think the average thoughtful person in America has any problem whatsoever with someone revisiting. In fact, I think the average person in America does it all the time. I don't think you can be a parent and not have to admit that you were wrong about something. The whole
Every day, every day.
every day, every single
Yes.
day, you are reminded about how you blew it
Yeah.
that morning when you.
Yeah.
So
Correct.
like, this is why I'm like this. These kinds of things. Is just like a tempest in a teapot.
We like to end the show with moments that you're still chasing. What's one moment you hope people remember you for?
Well, I hope that the things I'm remembered for are private things, not public things. I hope that at my funeral, it will be people who come because they've been personally touched by me, not because they admired some public thing that I had done.
That's an excellent answer. All right. Well, the show is called Glass Half Full. Is Malcolm Gladwell a half glass full guy or your glass half empty guy?
I am half full all the way. You know what the engineer says?
What?
The optimist says the glass is half full. The pessimist says the glass is half empty. The engineer says the glass is twice as large as it needs to be.
That's good. That's
I might
good.
be the engineer.
Okay, I'll take that. Cheers to you, Malcolm. Cheers
Cheers.
to your success. Cheers to our conversation, and cheers to the future.
Good. Thanks, Craig.
Well, there you have it. Malcolm Gladwell, The Revenge of the Tipping Point is out now. A big thanks to Malcolm for his time, and a big thanks to him for also sharing his perspective on the way we have conversations in our country right now, especially. So anyway, I enjoyed my time with Malcolm. I hope you did as well. And as you know, the corporate overlords who run this podcast really want me to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this episode. You can also comment on this episode as well. That's where you leave your thoughts and your concerns and any advice that you might have on guests moving forward. Anyway, I digress. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Glass Half Full. And remember, the glass, it's half full.
Hey, thanks for watching. And don't forget, you can catch the Today Show every morning on NBC or take Today when you're on the go. Just follow the Today podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.